Thanks for the opportunity to speak with you all today. My name is Dr. Tim Portinga. I'm a psychologist on staff here at Hazelden, Plymouth. I'm a senior clinician and clinical supervisor with the Mental Health Department. And today I'm going to be talking about the development of chemical dependency, and I want to speak about it mostly from a psychological standpoint. I want to talk about the development of chemical dependency, what it looks like as it starts to grow, as it goes through its normal process, and then also what normal recovery looks like for most people most of the time. I also want to talk about some primary mental health themes in early recovery. So that gives us about 3 semesters worth of work, and we're going to do our best to get through it in the next 55 minutes. And hopefully we'll have a chance to explain some of this stuff in more detail too. I mentioned I'm Dr. Portinga. I'm also Tim Alcoholic Addict. I went through treatment myself back when I was 24. I spent 6 months in a halfway house, 2 years doing outpatient work. I continued to go to AA meetings, very much involved in the AA program. And I think that's important for people to hear. And I always want to emphasize that with folks. We aren't an anonymous people. We don't wear it on our sleeves. We don't do protest marches. We don't run up and down fields with signs asking for support. But I think it's important that people should know that our best guess, according to research, approximately 23 million people in America today are clean and sober, living productive lives. You tend to not hear about those people. You just hear about us when we make a mess of our lives. But I think it's important for people to know. People do get clean and sober. They go on and lead successful lives, and that's part of what I want to talk about today. In order to do this lecture, I'm going to talk mainly about 2 primary people. I'm going to use this as sort of structure, or bones, if you will, for today's lecture. And then I also want to interweave some of my own experiences as a way to flesh this information out just a little bit more. The first character I want to talk about is a guy by the name of Emil Jelinek. Jelinek was a biostatistician by training. He first went to the University of Leipzig. He finished his career, educational career anyway, his own personal education at the University of Oxford, and came over to the States shortly thereafter. First went to Yale, Columbia shortly thereafter. He went to the World Health Organization back in Europe. Spent 5 or 6 years with them, came back to the States, and went to Stanford, where he finished his career. Most of his publishing was taking place in the late 50s and 60s. Jelinek was an interesting character. He was a biostatistician by training. His specific specialty was to make statistical models to describe biological phenomenon. And he had a real passion for trying to understand alcoholism. You need to bear in mind that back in the 50s and 60s, people didn't think that alcoholism was a disease. The vast majority of people thought that it was a character flaw. It was some kind of a moral shortcoming. It was an ethical problem. There was a tremendous amount of disparity, prejudice against people that were alcoholics and addicts. And Jelinek believed that there was a disease involved. He watched people time and time again promise themselves, their loved ones, that they were going to make a change and be unable to do so. And he set about to try to describe how this looks. Now, he finally came up with what he called the Jelinek curve, and this is the result of interviewing literally hundreds of people in recovery and people in their addiction. I'm going to give you a pretty heavily paraphrased version of Jelinek's curve here today, but I think it's still a very useful, very pertinent model. When Jelinek first started doing his research, one of the primary things that he ran into was that just about everybody that he interviewed had a family member, first generation, second generation, who had also struggled with some form of chemical dependency, addiction, alcoholism. We know a lot more about this today than what Jelinek knew at his time. Most research says anywhere from 50 to 60%. I've seen some studies that are higher. 60% of people who end up with this diagnosis have a clearly identified family member, again, first generation, second generation, who've also struggled with chemical dependency. We know that if you have a clearly identified family member who's struggled with drug addiction, chemical dependency, that your odds are about 50% greater than the rest of the population of having some form of problems with drug abuse along the line. We're learning more and more about this as it goes forward. It's clearly not only biology, it's also environmental, it's also about our own specific behaviors. It's not nature or nurture, it's clearly both. But the genetic portion obviously plays a big part for the majority of us that end up with this diagnosis. We used to think there was either one gene, you either had it or you didn't. Current research says there's something like 300 genes that have been implicated in chemical dependency. I've heard genetic researchers before refer to this phenomenon as a spectrum disorder. These same 300 genes that are often correlated with chemical dependency are often seen as problematic in regards to behavioral regulation and emotional regulation. I kind of get a kick out of this because this is the classic triumvirate for us in chemical dependency. We seem to have a very distinct reaction to alcohol chemical use. We seem to struggle with behavioral, emotional regulation. I sometimes get a little bit of a kick out of the fact that we're surprised when something like 98% of our clients have a coexisting disorder, struggle with anxiety, struggle with depression. These are all the same sort of processes underneath it when we come right down to it. There are 5 main regions of the brains that are implicated with chemical dependency. We see this going forward, and I don't want to say too much about this here. This research continues to change, certainly not static or stopped at a given point, moving ahead very quickly now because of the recent advent of much more sophisticated fMRI studies and PET scans. But this research continues to go forward. When we start to use, we seem to have very different experiences than what normal folks have, and this seems to happen to us pretty quickly. I know in my own case, this is happening back in high school. Now, my parents are very conservative, very religious folks. I've heard often over the years about the dangers of alcohol. I've never seen my parents have so much as a glass of wine. I started to have some friends that were drinking, and I was interested in what that was all about. I wanted to learn about it as much as anything. I was a tall, awkward, skinny, anxious kind of a kid, and I decided I was going to do it a little bit differently, a little bit of early rationalization here. I wanted to see what this was all about. I decided I was going to have a couple of beers with some friends at a party, but I was going to take some notes. I was going to learn about this whole thing. I took a little notebook in my back pocket with a pen, and I actually did this. I went to the party, I had a couple of beers, I ran out to the car, I made a couple of notes, I went back to the party, and frankly, I don't remember much after that. I very quickly got intoxicated, pretty much blacked out. Some friends took me home. My parents were very disappointed. I endured several hours of long, difficult, serious conversation afterwards. It obviously disappointed my parents and hurt their feelings. But despite all of that, despite burning my hand on the stove, if you will, that very first time out, I remember 2 things about that experience. First of all, where has this been my whole life? Get enough beer in me, tall, awkward, skinny, bookworm kind of a kid. I can tell jokes, I can flirt, I can even dance, for God's sakes. This is a really big deal. I liked it a lot. It seemed to fill a hole in me that I didn't even know that I had before. I felt at ease, I felt comfortable, I felt in the right place. And secondly, very clearly, what the hell is wrong with my parents? How did my parents get so screwed up on this whole deal? And this is classic for most of us. We discover we like it a lot. In effect, we almost kind of sign up. This is what happens for us. And secondly, we almost instantly start questioning social norms. If this feels so good, if this feels so right, why would people not want me to do this? What could possibly be wrong with folks to have a moral decision against me doing this? This is classic for most of us. We discover we like it. We start pushing away from people who criticize our chemical use. We start questioning social norms, and we do it our own way. Normally, this is the experience that most of us will share. Third corner here is some form of a stressor. This can be an internal, pre-existing emotional kind of a concern. Maybe we tend to be anxious. Maybe we tend to be depressed. Maybe we worry about things a little bit too much. In those cases, we can create our own kind of issues. This can be an external, environmental kind of a concern. Maybe we change schools. Maybe there's some pressures within the family, we move to a different city, there's some financial concerns. In any case, though, the next discovery that we make is that we can feel however we want to feel, whenever we want to feel that way. We don't have to wait for Friday, Saturday nights. We don't have to wait for other people to be around to use with us. We can do a quick one hit on the way to school. We can use quickly over lunch. We can use on our way to football practice. We can feel however we want to feel, whenever we want to feel that way. This isn't just minimizing emotions that we don't like. This isn't just avoiding things that we do not experience. This is also amplifying emotions that we do like. If going to a movie is fun, it's twice as fun if we're a little bit high. This is an active phase for us. We discover we can feel however we want to feel, whenever we want to feel that way. Now, this is a significant concern, particularly for adolescents. One of the major things that adolescents are supposed to be figuring out at this time in their life is how to go from being a child, usually, a child who wants what they want when they want it, who is unable to delay gratification, who is willing to manipulate people emotionally for what they want, to somehow being an adult who's able to show up at 7 o'clock in the morning for a job they may not like all that much. This is called learning. We learn how to delay gratification. We learn how to do the small things that we need to do on a consistent basis in order to get good long-term rewards. We're supposed to learn this primarily in two ways. First of all, our brain is continuing to develop. The prefrontal cortex right behind our foreheads here is mostly involved with executive functioning. That's the last part of our brain to develop. It often develops into our mid-20s, sometimes even a little bit later. But I think secondly, perhaps most importantly, is through our day-to-day experiences. We learn that if we want to have a good outcome in a class, we've got to study. We've got to show up on time. If we want to have a good outcome on the playing field, we've got to go to all the practices. We've got to do all that hard work that we need to do to develop our skills. Emotional maturity is very much the same way. We learn that we have to do the difficult things, we have to face disappointments, we have to experience highs and lows in appropriate ways in order to gauge what our behavior should be, what our thinking should be long term. When kids start to manage their emotions through chemical use, they start to miss these emotionally developmental experiences. Rather than learning that they have to do small amounts on a day-by-day basis to get good long-term rewards, what they learn is that they can get high. What they learn is that they can manage their emotions. They can feel however they want to feel. What this results in is, to a large degree, a degradation of their emotional development. We often see this in treatment. We have kids that are 21, 22, 23 years old. They look like young adults. They can carry themselves appropriately in most situations most of the time. But when push comes to shove, their emotional experiences are very much like 14, 15-year-old kids, and this is a huge developmental difference. They tend to want what they want when they want it. They're willing to throw a temper tantrum if they don't get what they want. They're willing to manipulate people for their emotional needs. It's one of the common things that we see in treatment settings, and it's one of the bigger things that we work with. Our stage is set. As we continue to use, at some point this becomes problematic. We cross through the proverbial thin blue line. And as this occurs, we start to have a lot of little things go wrong. This happens for us on a consistent basis. We spend more and more time planning to get high, actually being high, making sure that we're covering our tracks, making sure we're with people who accept our behaviors, recovering from being high, being in withdrawal, making sure we're ready for the next time around. This leaves less and less time for studying. This leaves less and less time for showing up on time for work. This leaves less and less time for extracurricular activities. What happens in its place is that we get into a steady pattern of deterioration. We just can't quite do what we would like to do. This happens in the face of a little ego inside of ourselves that's desperately trying to feel good about ourselves. We have this ego that's desperately looking for things to feel good about, and in that place, instead, we find small disappointments, frustrations, irritations. Our grades aren't quite as good as they used to be. We're not getting positive feedback from teachers, coaches, parents that we used to get. We basically have two options at this point. One is to accept that our problematic chemical use is getting worse. This we usually do not do, but sometimes we'll do it for short periods. You see often a lot of up and down in early chemical use, particularly amongst kids. They'll burn their hand on the stove, they'll resolve to change things, they'll get back in gear for a short period of time. They slowly go back to use, they create their own next crisis. We see a lot of up and down use early on. Sometimes we can actually see that things aren't working the way we would like them to work. But often, and this is the strongest trajectory in this process, often what we choose to do is to look the other way. Often what we choose to do is to ignore the fact that we're going downhill, we're not showing up as well as we would like to. We learn to rationalize, minimize, justify, and deny. We learn to spin the truth, to make it be what we need it to be, to feel okay about ourselves despite the fact that we're rapidly losing evidence in our lives that we can use to feel good about ourselves. This, I believe, is the heart and soul of chemical dependency. We learn that truth is plastic. We can make it be what we need it to be, to feel okay about ourselves, despite the fact that that's not the case. This first stage is typified by the truth no longer equaling the truth. For me, this is happening my first couple years of college. I was working hard to get good grades. Most of my self-esteem was wrapped around being a good student, being that kid that got A's. Let's say I've got a quiz the next day, the night before. I would have been headed out to the library, books under my arm, ready for an exciting night in the library. Let's say on my way out the door, I run into my pal Bob. Bob is actually still a friend of mine. We correspond regularly. Back in the day, Bob was a pretty good stoner. Bob's a professor at Kent State now. Big difference. Back in the day, Bob would have said, "Hey, Tim, I got that new album down at the shop. It's a rock and roll band. It features a violin player. Can you believe such a thing? What a bizarre thing. I think they're called Kansas, but you should come down and check this thing out." So down to Bob's room, talking about the 70s here, down to Bob's room. And of course I know his little bong is going to come out. I could still see it in the back of my mind here. My intention, capital I intention, one quick bong hit, get the hell out of here. I got to study tonight. This is important to me. This is one of the classic symptoms of chemical dependency. Once we get our substance into our systems, we tend to lose the off switch. One of the classic symptoms is that we usually often use more than we intend. The complicated thing I think for a lot of people to understand about this is that our intentions are genuine. When we tell people that we intended just to have one, we were sincere about that. We actually believed that ourselves at the time. But once we get that substance into our systems, we lose the off switch. We usually use more than we intend. To get back to the story, one bong hit turns into 4 or 5. But I finally pull myself out of there. I'm off to the library. I've got to study. I've got a quiz tomorrow. Instead of reading the 30 pages that I had intended to review, maybe I get through 15 or 20, and half of those pages I've got to read twice. Instead of doing a nice study guide, I'm scribbling in the margin. I waste an hour talking to Mary. The next day I take the quiz. Let's say I get a B minus, not the end of the world, not the A I'm looking for. My roommate the first couple years was a full scholarship football player. He used to like to tease me about how much I studied. If he had asked me about my quiz, I would have told him I got a B. He would have enjoyed giving me the needle about that. What I would have told him is that, you know, our English department here really sucks. My professor is an assistant adjunct professor. Can you believe that? All the tuition we pay, we've got an assistant professor here. On top of that, the lectures make no sense with the syllabus. The syllabus doesn't match our quizzes. He's got us reading Catcher in the Rye. I could study more if you'd pick up your laundry. You see where I'm going with this? I would have been able to give him a dozen reasons why I had gotten that B. None of them would have had anything to do with the fact that I was stoned the night before. This is our consistent pattern. We learn over time to spin the truth, to rationalize, to minimize, to justify, to explain to ourselves and the world what's going on in our lives in order to avoid the truth. The truth is that our chemical use is getting problematic, okay? As we continue to use, ramifications start getting bigger. The next problem that we have is trust. People who know us and care about us start to understand that something is wrong. Usually this is the people that are closest to us, often it's family early on. Our chemical use, our rationalization, minimization, justification, truth spinning machine works to put us in conflict with just about everybody that we care about. On an ongoing basis, we find ourselves being secretive, giving half-truths, trying to avoid the ramifications of our actual use. As this occurs, the people that know us get slowly more and more frustrated. They start to understand that 1 + 1 doesn't always equal 2 with us. As a result, they usually push. They usually push to try to get to the truth. They confront us. They start to try to control us. They start to try to take things away. Our response to that is usually nasty. We basically have 2 extremes that we will do in order to respond when people try to confront us about these kinds of problems. The first one is the pain response. Mom and Dad, you don't know me, you don't care about me. As a matter of fact, I've carefully memorized everything you've done wrong in the last 5 years. If you want to have a fight about me getting home late for curfew, let's go. I'm ready to go. Mom and Dad think they're having a fight about the kid being late for curfew. The truth is, they're fighting against his truth-spinning machine. The young person has much more at stake, much more skin in the game here. They will not lose this fight. They usually come out tooth and nail. Often it's the angry response. The other end of the spectrum is the pain response. Mom and Dad, you don't know me, you don't care about me. As a matter of fact, I don't think you love me enough. I think that you don't trust me anymore. That means you don't care about me. If you're not going to love me and trust me in this family, maybe I don't need to be part of this family. Maybe I'll just leave. This is the normal process. Either we're angry or we threaten to leave. Basically, what the chemically dependent person is trying to do here is to teach the persons in their life that the truth is painful. Okay, so the primary thing that I would like you to understand here is when people confront us and try to bring us back to the truth, we strike back with either fear, which usually ends up in talking about leaving, or anger, which ends up being pain. The fear and pain cycle essentially are the beginning of codependency. What the young person is trying to do is to teach his parents that if they insist on the truth, if they insist on confronting them about their behaviors, for instance, they will strike back either with anger or they will threaten to leave. Essentially what they're trying to teach their family is it's much safer to simply to go along with their avoidance, their rationalization, their minimization, and avoid talking about these important truths. Essentially, this is the beginning of codependency. I think you can imagine your codependency as the degree to which you're willing to avoid the truth because of fear of the emotional backlash. I don't know if you've ever seen that intervention television show. I watch it every once in a while. Like I can't get enough of this here at work. I've got to see this on TV also at night. But they always end the same way. You've got a circle with family and friends, and they're doing their best to sell the truth, and they are usually crying. They're upset, they're worried, and they're scared. The addict alcoholic is in the center of the circle, in most cases, lie, trying to avoid the truth, and they're usually angry or threatening to leave. This is our classic behavior with people who love us and care about us. We threaten to leave. Facing the truth is painful. What I want you to understand simply is that the truth is the truth is the truth, and it's important to remember that when you're working in this early recovery phase. Finally, if we continue to use, ramifications continue to grow. The next problem that we have is systems. Any system that requires us to do what we say we're going to do, to tell the truth, to admit when we've made a mistake, we start having problems with. We go from good quality schools to medium quality schools to poor schools. We go from good friends, medium friends to poor friends. We go from good jobs to medium jobs to poor jobs. Essentially, we start out life with an awful lot of options, and as time goes by, we end with fewer and fewer options. Our society tries to control us, to control the damage that we're making. If we continue to use past this point, we eventually start to spiral. Things go wrong, so I use. Because I use, things go wrong, we start spiraling down. Another important point to remember here is that physiological dependence, physical dependence, is usually happening in the lower third. We're used to, our culture is used to thinking about chemical dependency, alcoholism, as physical dependency. In other words, I can't be an alcoholic unless I'm physically dependent. Until I'm shaking in the morning and needing that drink, I can't possibly be alcoholic. What I want you to understand is it's usually the last thing that happens. It represents a more chronic situation, and it's a result of a long time of psychological dependency and distorted behaviors over time. Some substances produce physical dependency much more quickly than others. There are differences in this scenario, but what I want you to understand is the psychological process underneath it are the same for all. It's not even necessary to be physically dependent to be found with a substance use disorder according to criteria that we all use. So, at some point, we're going to start creating disasters. This can be high, this can be medium, this can be low. But we consistently will do stupid things. I don't mean stupid things cognitively, but accidentally. We'll start having more and more problems. We create crises. If we're lucky, the crisis will mobilize some resources. We'll get a chance to get some structure in our lives and start to face this problem. If we're unlucky and we make this little crisis and people try to ignore it as time goes by, if we get enough time, we'll simply right ourselves. We get back to that rationalization, minimization, justification process, and we start telling ourselves little white lies, things like, you know something, I think the problem is really the cocaine. If I can stay away from the cocaine and I simply stick with the marijuana maintenance plan, I'll be good. And slowly we sneak back into chemical use. Very quickly we're right back to where we were before. If we're lucky, we create a crisis, resources get mobilized, we get a chance to make a change. We can decide that we want to get into recovery. The first thing that we have to do in this process is to get back the truth. Simplest possible terms. We have to get back to the truth is the truth is the truth. We have to break through as much as we can this rationalization, minimization, justification process. What I want you to understand is that the average alcoholic and addict hate this with a passion. We know intuitively that if we start getting honest about all this stuff, we're going to have to tell the family what really happened to that missing $500. What really happened to that vase that's no longer over the fireplace. We're going to have to tell people where we were last Thanksgiving when we didn't show up. Perhaps more importantly, and sometimes this is even more difficult, this means that we're going to have to let go of this manipulation that we're doing of other people. It means that we're going to have to give up this rationalization, minimization, justification process, that way that we manipulate people to get what we want. This is basically what we're doing in a treatment setting. We're walking around with a mirror. We're showing Bobby, Mary, the truth of where they are as close as we possibly can. We're holding up a mirror so they can see themselves accurately. We usually do not like this. We usually are very frustrated, irritated, scared when we start to come to the truth that we've been doing our best to avoid for all this time. We can be angry. We can attempt to manipulate folks. Often we see clients do the same things to us that they've been doing to their parents. They get angry, they try to intimidate us like they have done to their parents. They threaten to leave, they try to hurt emotionally. The same thing that they've done to their parents, they'll do to us. Often we get a pretty good view of how our clients are treating their parents by how they treat us. Very frustrating process, but we've got to get back to the truth is the truth is the truth as much as we possibly can. I know in treatment I mentioned already that we're usually doing our best to hold up a mirror for our clients so they can see themselves accurately. I have to say we do our best to avoid judging, avoid blaming, avoid guilting. We want to do it as cleanly as we simply can. Truth is the truth is the truth. If we can do this, we can start to rebuild trust with people. This is one of the fundamental things in early recovery, is the knowledge that it's up to us to rebuild trust with other people. And this is something that I always want to spend some time with when it comes to talking with family members and people that are involved with us in early recovery. Alcoholics and addicts are unusually adept at manipulating people for trust. We are very used to demanding that people trust us and threatening if they don't trust us, that they don't give us what we want. What I want you to understand in early recovery is that parents and family members often feel that it's incumbent upon them to start to give trust back to the alcoholic addict. That it's up to them somehow to take this leap of faith, to start to trust this person, whom in fact is proven that they're often untrustworthy. What I want you to understand today when you're listening to me, it's the alcoholic addict's job to earn your trust back. It's up to us to tell the truth, to do the things that we need to do, to admit when we've made mistakes, to earn your trust back. Frankly, you are hurting our recovery process if you give us your trust before we have earned it. This is very difficult for parents and families to often hear, but it's the primary job of the alcoholic and addict to earn your trust back, rather than for you to believe that you need to give it to us. I hope this makes sense. When we can rebuild trust with people over time, we can function in systems again. As a matter of fact, we can do quite well in systems, and I always like to emphasize this information. The best research that we've been able to do, as I mentioned earlier today, there are something like 23 million people that are clean and sober in America today that have been clean and sober for over 5 years or longer. We know a few things about this group of people, and we continue to learn more about them. Our best information, they earn more than the average American. They're more likely to volunteer time to community organizations. They're more likely to pay their taxes on time. They are less likely to get a divorce. I love these options. They talk more about who we become as a person. And I'd like you to think about this for a minute. Imagine yourself as an employer. How would you like to hire someone who consistently did what they say they're going to do, that tell the truth, that admit when they make a mistake before they get busted? Odds are good they would make a good employee, and then over time, once they learn your business, they start looking around for other employees to help. They're unusually empathetic, and they tend to be helpful with other people. You think you might want to give them a raise? Do you think you might want to keep them around? Recovering people tend to do very well in the outside world when they get a good grasp of how this recovery process works. I want to talk a little bit more here about some mental health concerns. I'll erase my board quickly. One of my favorite psychologists is a guy by the name of Martin Seligman, past president of the American Psychological Association, still is at the University of Pennsylvania, one of the major researchers, academics in the field of psychology today. He has always been interested in anxiety and depression, and he did one of the classic experiments back a number of years ago here now. But he was trying to decide or understand where anxiety and depression were coming from. Did a really very classic experiment. 3 cages of rats. Had a control group, experimental 1, experimental 2. Experimental 1 and 2 had a wire grid put into the main living area of the cage. Experimental 1 had essentially a patio attached to the cage. There's a low wall here, and this portion of the floor was in wood. Once the rats were acclimated to their cages, they started getting random electrical shocks. There was no way for the rats to anticipate when these shocks were going to come, completely random in all ways. In experimental 1 here, one of these rats would sooner or later discover that if they bounce over this low wall to the wooden floor in the patio, that the shocks would go away. And rats are actually very adept at learning these kinds of things. They figure it out very quickly. If they get a shock, they bolt over the patio, they're safe. As soon as one rat figures it out, they all figure it out. And very quickly, the entire cage has got this down. They get a shock, they bolt over to the patio, they wait for a couple minutes until the coast is clear, and they slowly come back to their main living area. They have to, because their food and their sleeping quarters are all in the main area of the cage. In experimental 2, these poor guys can't escape. Regardless of what happens, they keep getting jolted. And in a very short time, it takes approximately a month, these rats start exhibiting some very different behaviors. They lose interest in eating. They're not playing on their wheels any longer. They don't snuggle at night like normal rats would. Their family systems start to break down. They get more aggressive. They get more irritable. They start to have little somatic concerns, I should say. Essentially, they show all the major symptoms of anxiety and depression. We have anxious and depressed rats. Whereas in experimental 1, they stay identical to the control group. Very little differences in their behaviors. Essentially, Seligman thought he had this figured out at this point. Aversive environment over time, uncontrollable, will result in anxiety and depression. When people can control their environment, they can escape their aversive environment, they maintain good mental health. He stops the shocks, sits back and sees what will happen, waits for what will happen. Experimental 2 bounces right back to normal functioning. They're eating, they're sleeping, they're playing on their wheel, they're snuggling at night. They're happy campers. Seligman went on to coin the phrase learned helplessness, and a lot of you will be familiar with this term. We still run into it from time to time in the psychological literature. Seligman no longer likes this phrase. A number of years ago now, he wrote a book called Learned Optimism, discussing the other side of the equation. But essentially, he demonstrated that through an aversive environment over time, these rats would start to give up. They'd display anxiety and depression, take away the aversive environment, and the rats would come back to normal functioning. Beautiful study, well done, well documented, well published. Seligman wanted to go further, though. He wanted to figure out if this really worked with people. Was this an accurate representation of what happened with real people? He had a hard time getting people to jump into their cage. Couldn't quite get that one done. He came up with a strategy. He decided to devise a study with college students. There's a little joke in here somewhere. If you've got rats and you've got real people, it's a common middle ground to look at college students. He was teaching Psych 1001 at the time, and he offered extra credit to his students if they would participate in the study. The only kicker was that they might not know that they were selected. If they were selected, at the end of the study, they would get a full disclosure. They would get a full explanation of the nature of the study. When you do this in Psych 1001, everybody signs up. They all want the extra credit that goes along with this study. Seligman randomly selected a number of students, put everyone in assigned chairs so he knew where they were. From that point forward, did everything possible to make life miserable for these 10 kids. Every week, he also started doing measures of mood to measure anxiety and depression across the entire class, not only these kids that were selected for the study, but for the entire class. He did everything he could to make life miserable for these kids. He would call on them with difficult questions that were virtually impossible to answer, and when they screwed it up, he would turn to one of the other kids that weren't in the study and ask them an easy question designed to show the difference. He would make fun of these kids and he would berate them if they weren't able to answer the questions correctly. He started posting grades on the wall. Here's the kicker. He's using names, not serial numbers, and he artificially manipulates their grades. If they do A work, he gives them C's. If they do C work, he gives them F's. He's continuing to harass them in class. He starts to suggest that maybe they could use some remedial work, and he takes these kids and brings them off to the side. They have to write more papers, they have to take more quizzes. He continues to manipulate their grades. Lo and behold, they're getting nervous. They're getting kind of sad. They're getting kind of angry. The rest of the class is functioning just fine. Seligman waited for one of the kids to leave his class, basically withdraw from his class. That was his signal that it was time to pull the plug from the study. He brought all these kids back into his office. He explained what he'd been up to. He explained his concept of learned helplessness, adversive environment over time, and he thoroughly interviewed all of these students. Interesting thing happened. One of the classic things that we see in science sometimes, we get a surprise. Something happens differently from his hypothesis. He basically had two distinctly different reactions within this group of students. One group said things like, you know what, the study really was pretty difficult and I didn't like going through all of those criticisms and all those hard times, but I discovered something about myself. I'm stronger than I thought I was. I've got deeper reserves than I thought I did. It forced me to dig down and to learn more about myself. I'm actually kind of grateful that I went through this whole process. The other group said things like, you know what, this study sucked and it really sucked. And I think I'm somehow damaged and it wasn't fair. I don't know why you chose me. I think somehow you knew that I was weak to begin with. You played on my weaknesses. I'm angry, I'm frustrated, I'm doubting myself. I'm thinking about suing the school, for God's sakes. Very different reactions. Essentially had an emotionally resilient group and an emotionally vulnerable group. Had not expected this. Kind of blew his hypothesis out of the water. Same experience, two very different reactions. Essentially, this reflects what we now know as cognitive behavioral theory. It doesn't matter so much what happens to us in our day-to-day lives, but what does matter is how we interpret it and how we think about these day-to-day events. Our emotions are largely a result of how we interpret the things that happen to us in our day-to-day living. Seligman became fascinated with this, however. He started researching people who, like these resilient individuals, had gone through difficult experiences. He wanted to understand what was different about them, what was different in their thinking that let them go through very difficult situations, left them stronger, more resilient, and still giving and wanting to do the right thing going forward. Tremendous amount of research has been done over the years regarding resilient folks, relatively new field, approximately 15 years old. But we know that there are three primary thinking differences that separate emotionally resilient folks from emotionally vulnerable folks. The reason I'm subjecting you to this whole discussion around Seligman's work here is that these are the same kind of thinking issues that we see amongst most people in early recovery. The first one is how we deal with change. Emotionally resilient people tend to be curious about change. They tend to be open to trying new ideas. When they see something new, they tend to be interested, they tend to be curious. They want to figure out how it works. They want to see if there's something that they can learn. Emotionally vulnerable people, on the other hand, tend to avoid change. They tend to dislike it from the very beginning. I'm laughing because this is my normal reaction. We tend to distrust change. We look very carefully at it. We often wonder if there's a way to avoid. This is absolutely fundamental when it comes to talking about people in early recovery. One of the main things that alcoholics and addicts hear hundreds of times over our drinking and using careers is that we need to change. We're constantly being told, we need to do this differently, we got to stop doing this, we got to start doing this. Our basic instinctual reaction is to resist change. We see change as problematic. Many times we've tried to change before and our results have been unsuccessful. Not only do we dislike change, we come to view change as very painful. But yet that's what we're all about in this early recovery phase. We're trying to figure out how to do some change. One of the things that we know is that we can't make an alcoholic or an addict do anything. We can't force them to change. We can't manipulate them to change. But what we can do is show them people who have changed. We can show them individuals who have made successful lives for themselves. What we know about alcoholics and addicts is they're willing to try something different if they see a benefit. If they see something that works for them. You know, the classic discussion of faith, hope for alcoholics and addicts is if this idiot can do it, I can do it. What we're constantly doing here is we're talking about change. We're putting it together. We're suggesting people try things. We're trying to show them people who have made changes in their lives. This is fundamentally, of course, supportive of AA's experience. We want people to see other people in recovery. We want them to learn about other people in recovery. We want to see that it's absolutely possible for them to make a positive change. Not because we tell them they have to, but because they have the opportunity. Second difference is about what we call pervasive thinking. Emotionally resilient individuals tend to be very good at knowing the difference between small problems and big problems. They're very good at separating these out. They resist the temptation of reacting too big or too small to a situation. Emotionally vulnerable people, on the other hand, tend to be very poor at knowing the difference between small problems and big problems. They often turn small problems into bigger problems out of context. If you drill down a little bit further, emotionally resilient individuals have a distinct strategy. The strategy that they use to know the difference between small problems and big problems is that they talk about it. How's this for dramatic, right? High science. They actually talk things over. When they run into a small problem, they reach out to someone that they know, someone that they trust, someone that they've got a strong positive relationship with, and they talk it over. Emotionally vulnerable people, on the other hand, do the exact opposite. When they run into a problem, something that they don't understand, something that they're not prepared for, they tend to isolate, they tend to withdraw, they tend to avoid. When we do that, our own subjective thinking processes tend to take small problems and turn them into big problems, which become launching points for anxiety and depression. Let me give you a quick example. A few years ago, my annual review was coming up. I was passing my boss in the hallway as she was walking towards me. I said, "Hey boss, how you doing? Can't wait for that review tomorrow." And my boss looked at me and frowned, shook her head, kept walking. I went home from work that day. I went to bed that night. I started thinking, my boss is mad. It's probably about me. It's probably because of my review tomorrow. She's going to have to tell me something I don't want to hear. That's probably I'm not going to get the raise I need. It's going to be even harder to pay for my kid in college. Boy, forget that. I got another kid on the way. I got to make more money somehow. I love working at Hazelden, but this nonprofit stuff has absolutely got a glass ceiling. I got to make more money somehow. The only way I can do that is private practice. I got to talk to my friends in private practice. Maybe I got to do custody evaluations. Maybe I got to do forensic evaluations. I hate those things, but they pay. Spent the whole night tossing and turning, anxious, worried, scared. The next day, my review goes fine. And I talked to my boss after the review, and I asked her about the day before. You know, we were walking down the hallway and you frowned at me. What was happening? And she said, you know, I should have said something to you at the time, and I kind of thought about it, but I just had a horrible headache yesterday. It turns out that frown had absolutely nothing to do with me. It was all about her head. I spent the whole night worried, scared, thinking about making changes. I went from essentially getting a frown from my boss to questioning my career over the course of a 12-hour time span. Classic example of pervasive thinking. I took something small out of context, I turned it into a big problem, I didn't talk it over with anyone, I kept it to myself, I got very anxious, very worried, very scared. Classic emotionally vulnerable response. Emotionally resilient people learn to talk things over. They do this radical thing called talking. They tend to be very good at keeping people in their lives that they know and trust. When they run into an issue, they call somebody. They talk it over. They do this radical thing. One of the things that your kids are hearing constantly here in treatment is to talk it over. They're hearing it 20 times a day. Talk to your counselor, talk to your therapist, talk to the techs, talk to the supervisor, talk to the kitchen staff, talk to your peers, talk to the house moms, talk to somebody for God's sakes, but let's talk it over. We want people to get used to bringing people in their lives, particularly learning to look for quality people that they can trust, and as they do this, to talk things over. This is one of the primary bulwarks against anxiety and depression. And then thirdly, what's called personal thinking. This refers mainly to values. Emotionally resilient people tend to be very much aware of their values. When their thinking and their behavior reflect their values, they tend to feel good about themselves. They instinctively learn to base their self-esteem, how they evaluate themselves, on how closely their thinking and their behavior reflects their values. When they're close, they feel good. When they're not close, they move closer to their values and things work better. Emotionally vulnerable people, on the other hand, usually don't know what their values are. They couldn't tell you when pressed. They obviously, I shouldn't say obviously, but they often don't know what their primary values are. As a result, when they try to build self-esteem, when they try to see themselves in the world, because they don't have a firm footing, they usually try to understand their self-esteem by how they compare with other people. They try to compare themselves with others to see how they're doing. This almost never works. There's a thing called attribution error. We usually don't see people accurately. When we're trying to base our self-esteem on how we compare with other people, we almost always fall short. The reason why this is so important for recovering folks is that I want you to understand one thing, and this is very important. Active addiction destroys values. Over time, as we humiliate ourselves, as we embarrass ourselves with people that we care about, as we find ourselves in untenable situations, as we hurt the people that we love, we start slowly rejecting values. We start telling ourselves that nobody really loves us, nobody really cares, there is no such thing as justice, nobody will listen to me. We see values as a luxury that we can't afford, and we slowly jettison these values. As a result, we're often emotionally bankrupt, spiritually bankrupt, and our values are gone by the time we get into treatment. One of the primary things that we're doing throughout recovery, but particularly in these early stages, is to bring us back to a point where we can recognize our values, values that we've had in the past, to help us learn how to bring our lives back into parallel with the values that we're adopting as we go forward. We do this by telling the truth. We do this by doing what we say we're going to do. We do this by admitting our mistakes. We do this by making amends. We do this by building better relationships over time. As we come to our values over time, we feel better about ourselves. This is a healthy self-esteem. And this is a self-esteem that ultimately drives us to be more involved with others, to be helpful, to be goal-oriented, and to be of service to other people. One of the primary things in early recovery. So let me summarize here quickly before we come to the end. One of the primary things we see in treatment centers is that people will come in and they will tell us, 28 days, get me clean and sober and get me the hell out of here. And what I want you to understand is that being clean and sober is the door that we walk through to get into recovery. Recovery is based on values. It's based on telling the truth. First, we start by breaking through our rationalization, minimization, justification process as quickly as we can and as thoroughly as we can. In order to do this, we need people in our lives that know us and care about us, that can consistently show us the mirror and show us the truth of our situation. As we can do this, we can rebuild trust. We can rebuild trust on who we are as a person rather than demanding it, rather than manipulating others for that trust that we desire. As we can do this, we can function in systems and we continue to move towards our values. We become useful to other people. We have something to offer. Slowly but surely, we start to have a sense of peace of mind. And ultimately, we move towards spirituality. I'm grateful for the opportunity to be able to have this talk today. Thank you for your attention. Wish you the best in the future.